Record number 0785, patient, Helena Wren. Date of admission, the 14th of June, 1903. Age, 19. Initial diagnosis, psychotic disorders with persistent auditory hallucinations and severe self-harming behavior. Reason for admission, intentional mutilation of hands in an episode described as an attempt to end the incessant music. Helena Wren, a young pianist from Liverpool, England, arrived at Asylum Blackwood in a state of shock, escorted by 2 policemen and accompanied by a local doctor who sedated her upon admission. The reason for her admission was both unusual and deeply disturbing. Helena had used a household object to mutilate her own hands, claiming that the act was necessary to silence the music that wouldn't stop. According to eyewitness accounts, she alternated between long periods of silence and fits of anguished screams, during which she incessantly mentioned the piano and the wrong notes. Her erratic behavior was described as hypnotic, with moments when her eyes seemed to follow something invisible around her, suddenly interrupting any communication. Born in 1884, Helena gained fame at an early age as a prodigious pianist. Critics described her as possessing a supernatural sensitivity, capable of evoking emotions beyond human understanding. However, in the months leading up to her admission, her parents noticed drastic changes in her behavior. Helena completely isolated herself, refusing performances and locking herself in her room for days on end. A key point in family reports was the description of a constant melody that Helena claimed to hear day and night. According to her, the music seemed to come from places no one can reach. The tone of her voice when speaking about the melody fluctuated between fascination and dread. In her last conversation before the incident, she said, "If I keep listening, it will come." After the self-mutilation, Helena began repeating disconnected phrases, mentioning a call that came from something beyond time. Her parents, terrified, interpreted these words as a result of possible hysteria or exhaustion. However, Helena's behavior during the journey to the asylum shocked the policemen who escorted her. They reported that, even under sedation, her fingers moved, as though playing an invisible piano, producing faint clicks that echoed through the carriage. Upon admission, Helena had a vacant, distant stare, constantly fixed on an empty point in the room. Her movements, though limited by the bandages on her hands, seemed to follow the rhythm of a melody that only she could hear. The nurses described her posture as choreographic, a dance of tension and madness that seemed to transcend any known diagnosis. Although the doctors initially associated the symptoms with schizophrenia or hysteria, Helena's reactions and the events surrounding her would soon reveal that this case defied the boundaries of medical understanding. In the first few nights following her admission, Helena was frequently observed murmuring to herself. Her words, often disconnected, followed a pattern that intrigued the staff. References to musical notes and tonalities appeared between long pauses and almost inaudible murmurs. "A minor, but no, lower, lower," noted one nurse. Helena's gaze remained fixed on a corner of the room, where there was nothing but peeling walls. The nurses reported an increasing sense of discomfort when staying in the room for long periods. It was as if the air was heavy, charged with something invisible, one of them described. Initially, the murmurs were treated as isolated delusions, common in patients with a similar diagnosis. However, on the 3rd night, something unexpected occurred. A nurse on duty reported hearing a soft melody coming from Helena's room. He believed it to be an auditory illusion, as no musical instrument was present in the building. However, upon investigating, he found Helena sitting on the bed with a slight smile on her lips. When asked about the sound, she responded with an unsettling calmness, "You don't understand. He's practicing." In the following days, Helena's symptoms became more pronounced. During evaluation sessions, she often stopped responding abruptly, tilting her head as if listening to something. Her posture was one of complete concentration, as though she were following a complex and inescapable symphony. When asked what she was hearing, she responded with words that chilled those present. "It's just the preparation." You'll hear it when it's ready." The staff began to avoid prolonged interactions with her, citing an indescribable discomfort. Helena's finger movements also began to change. Despite the bandages that enveloped her mutilated hands, her muscles seemed to move independently, performing gestures that imitated the playing of musical chords. "It was like watching a ghostly concert," wrote one doctor. Something in her fingers seemed alive. During a routine examination, the same doctor reported intense chills when touching her hands, describing the experience as holding the hands of a conductor during a performance that should not exist. One night, Helena was found out of bed, kneeling on the floor, her hands extended before her as if she were playing something invisible. Her back was arched in a posture that the nurses considered unnatural. When an attendant tried to lift her, Helena murmured, "Don't interrupt. His hair." The tone was both reverent and terrifying. That same night, patients in the corridor reported hearing piano sounds coming from different directions. Although the staff checked the rooms, no source for the sound was found. The connection between Helena and the other patients began to raise concerns. Even without interacting directly, her presence seemed to affect them deeply. A man who had not spoken in months whispered, "The notes follow me when she passes." Another, in a fit of madness, screamed, "Make it stop! Make it stop!" before attempting to harm himself with his nails. These events were recorded but never explained. Inexplicable phenomena began to accumulate around Helena. Shadows that did not match any light source began to move across the room. A smell of aged wood, similar to that of an old piano, permeated the air, and inexplicable vibrations in the floor of the adjacent corridor were recorded by staff. Some described these vibrations as similar to the impact of giant strings being played beneath the building, although no structural explanation could be found. The reports became so frequent that the staff began to avoid the corridor where Helena was housed. One nurse summed up the general feeling, "It's not her, exactly. It's what came with her. Something is waiting." As the medical team tried to reorganize, the oppressive silence in the corridor was interrupted by subtle and disturbing sounds, as if the very walls were breathing. The noises were irregular, a creaking that seemed to come from the depths of the building. One of the nurses noticed marks on the floor, small lines forming circular patterns around Helena's room. The marks were deep, as though something heavy had been dragged, but there was no object nearby that could explain them. The air in the place seemed denser, saturated by an invisible presence. Each breath was an effort, and the staff reported a sensation of weight on their shoulders, as though something was pressing them down. In the center of the room, Helena began to move again, even though she was unconscious. Her bandaged fingers slowly rose, curling into positions that resembled musical chords. At that moment, the sound of a piano began to echo through the corridor, but it seemed to come from everywhere at once. In the adjacent rooms, the patients began to react. An elderly man, who had previously remained in complete silence, began reciting random numbers in a frantic rhythm. Another patient repeatedly banged his head against the metal door, murmuring, "The notes, they are wrong." A third was found kneeling on the floor, hoarsely repeating, "His coming, his coming." These behaviors were recorded, but none could be explained clinically. The lights in the corridor began to flicker, casting grotesque shadows that seemed to move independently. A strong smell of burnt wood filled the air, accompanied by a sharp drop in temperature. A thin layer of ice began to form on the windows, while the air became almost suffocating. Several staff members reported feeling a presence behind them, although no one was near. A doctor attempted to enter the room to check on Helena, but upon crossing the threshold of the door, he was struck by a wave of heat that made him recoil. "It was like crossing an invisible barrier," he later reported, before collapsing in the corridor. Inside the room, Helena began to murmur, but the words coming from her mouth did not belong to any known language. Each sound seemed to carry in disproportionate weight, reverberating through the walls like an echo impossible to ignore. A nurse began to bleed from his nose and was hastily removed. "The words aren't just sound," he reportedly said afterward. "They are something more, something that clings to you. The team decided to sedate Helena heavily, but even high doses of medication had no effect. Her fingers moved with increasing intensity, and the sound of the piano grew louder, vibrating in the air as if it were a living presence. On the lower floor, chaos spread. Patients in 3 different wards began to scream simultaneously. Some scratched the walls with their nails until they bled, while others tried to attack their fellow patients. A man, who hadn't spoken for years, began to hum a complex melody, describing each note in detail. "They are playing for him," he murmured before ceasing. At the height of the panic, a nurse reported seeing a shadow rush down the corridor at high speed. Although the security cameras didn't capture anything, several staff members confirmed they felt something walking through the halls, but without touching the ground. Inside the room, Helena raised her head once more. Her eyes, once dull, were now completely black, reflecting the flickering lights. With a voice that seemed to come from multiple sources at once, she said, "Are you ready?" The tone was hypnotic and terrifying, causing a wave of panic among those present. A nurse fled the room, claiming to have heard his own voice calling him from within the room. Suddenly, all the lights went out. The entire building was plunged into darkness, and the only sound was the piano, now resonating at a deafening volume. The walls of the room began to tremble violently, and cracks appeared in the ceiling, as though the structure was about to collapse. Staff members screamed, convinced that the asylum would not survive the night. Then, as abruptly as it had started, everything stopped. The silence that followed was even more oppressive than the preceding chaos. When the lights returned, they were dimmer, flickering as though something had drained all the energy from the place. Inside the room, Helena lay on the floor, her eyes closed. Her movements had ceased, and the sound of the piano had vanished. However, the marks on the walls remained, glowing faintly like incandescent scars. One of the doctors tried to wipe them away with a cloth, but they resisted all efforts. "It's not paint, nor blood," he said. "It's as though it's part of the wall now." Helena was transferred to an isolated ward, but she never regained consciousness. Her fingers, however, continued to move at intervals, as though she was still playing. Nurses who approached reported hearing low and distorted notes, even when wearing ear protection. The events of that night were filed with several inexplicable gaps. Staff members began abandoning their posts, and those who remained reported frequent nightmares, accompanied by the melody that haunted their minds. Some claimed to hear the piano in their own homes, long after leaving the asylum. The last entry in Helena's record was made by a doctor who resisted the exodus of staff. "Something was awakened that night," he wrote, "and whatever it is, it's no longer confined to the walls of Asylum Blackwood." Helena Wren was officially declared in a permanent vegetative state following the events recorded on the 21st of July, 1903. Despite the efforts of the medical team, there were no signs of cognitive or physical recovery. Her body remained under observation in an isolated ward, but reports of disturbing phenomena around her continued to grow. Nurses and doctors who approached her room reported hearing piano notes, at first soft and hypnotic, but they became deafening as they tried to enter. The marks on the walls of her room, described as symbols or distorted musical staves, resisted all attempts to remove them. Painting, scraping, or even structural interventions only resulted in their reappearance, like scars embedded in the very essence of the building. A surveyor, called to assess possible weaknesses after cracks appeared in the ceiling and walls, claimed that Helena's room seemed to breathe. He abruptly abandoned the work, stating that he felt invisible eyes watching every movement. The phenomena around Helena were not limited to her ward. Reports of flickering lights, doors that locked or opened by themselves, and shadows moving against all logic became common throughout the asylum. These events seemed to intensify on nights when Helena's fingers began to move, as if playing a melody that no one could hear in its entirety. Some staff members described the feeling of being watched by a faceless presence, something that seemed to lurk in the deepest shadows. The patients who witnessed the events of that night suffered significant deterioration in their mental health. Many fell into states of absolute apathy, unable to respond to external stimuli. Others, who had previously shown mild symptoms, began to experience intense outbursts, mentioning the piano and the man who plays it. Fragments of codes and melodies were murmured repeatedly, many of which matched the descriptions Helena had made months earlier. One of the doctors, who left his position shortly after the events, left a disturbing note in his personal diary. "Helena is not alone. Something was called, and it cannot be undone. Whatever has come, it is trapped here with us." 2 years after her admission, Helena was transferred to a private hospital in London under direct orders from higher authorities. Her condition remained unchanged, but reports of supernatural phenomena at the asylum diminished shortly after her departure. However, a few months later, the hospital that received her was consumed by a fire of inexplicable origin. Few survived, and Helena was not found among the ruins. No official explanation was provided, but records of the incident mysteriously disappeared from government files. Although the entries in Helena Wren's record were closed, the echoes of her presence remain alive in Asylum Blackwood. The corridors of the building still harbor inexplicable sounds, shadows that dance against logic, and a distant melody that haunts those who dare to remember her case. This is just one of many accounts revealing the unfathomable mysteries that echo through the walls of Asylum Blackwood. Its files continue to bear witness to what cannot be explained, and what will never be forgotten. The secrets of Asylum Blackwood continue to resonate, bringing forth mysteries that defy logic and sanity. Subscribe to the channel to follow the next disturbing accounts and delve even deeper into the horrors that this place hides. Share your theories in the comments. What do you believe really happened to Helena Wren? Are you ready to uncover the shadows still lurking in Blackwood?